them here. Right. Okay. So in our first class, we had talked about the first 50 lines of MacFlecknoe and the way in which Dryden creates the mock heroic as a way of categorizing Shadwell as in three ways. One is Shadwell is categorized as a fool, a dunce, lacking intelligence, and an emperor of nonsense. At the same time, Shadwell is also categorized as a poor poet, belonging to a generation, a climactic generation of poor poets, which included Heywood, Shirley, Richard Flecknoe, and of course, the greatest of them all, Shadwell. So, fool, a poor poet, and thirdly, Dryden categorizes Shadwell as a representative of low, popular, cheap culture, as opposed to the sophistication of his own high courtly culture. So it is in these three ways that Dryden continuously ridicules Shadwell as a literary dunce. Now, the other thing that you need to remember, and I have continuously harped on it, hammered on it really, is that there are three sets of allusions that Dryden uses. He uses the classical allusions of Greco-Roman civilization to create the heroic mode from which the mock heroic will proceed through bathos. He has used a set of Christian allusions which refer to wisdom and enlightenment, and therefore through the bathos will refer to Shadwell's folly, stupidity. And there's an entire set of contemporary literary allusions related with the contemporary literary milieu, including Shadwell's own plays, Flecknoe's own plays, which then bring out the poor quality or illustrate the literature of Shadwell and Flecknoe as extremely cheap and of inferior quality. So three purposes, three strategies of allusions is what we have looked at in the initial part. And we have seen how dominantly the two metaphors that operate in the poem are that of the coronation, the passing on of power from the king to the prince, and the metaphor of initiation of the new priest. So the entire structure is heroic. The operative words are irony and bathos, and therefore it is a mock heroic technique that Dryden is using, with concurrent waxing and waning, elevation and diminution, crests in comparing Shadwell with epic personalities, and bathos troughs in the emperor, in the empire of nonsense and folly which he rules in. So the operative strategy is irony and bathos, allusion, irony, bathos, elevation and diminution, crest and trough. These are the operative strategies which we have talked about. Now, we'd stopped at approximately the line number 50. So, and we talked about how Dryden often uses scatology as the morning toast that floats along sometimes. And then it's talking about Shadwell's lack of metrical structure with allusions to his performing before the king and of Flecknoe having performed before the king of Portugal. Now, continuing that, Dryden writes, and I hope you can see the screen. Is that visible?
Yes,
Is my screen visible?
Yes,
right, thank you.
Yes,
now,
yes,
right. Sometimes as prince of thy harmonious band, thou wieldest thy papers in thy threshing hand. So just as an operatic conductor conducts the opera, Shadwell conducts his music, his metrical structure, by sort of mimicking the motions of threshing. Now, threshing is beating, is the way in which the rice is separated from the chaff. The grain is separated from the chaff, through beating. So Shadwell's poetry is therefore one of anarchy. See, operatic conductor will gradually conduct. There will be wavy motions of his hand. Instead, Shadwell's music is bam, bam, bam. It's like, the motions of threshing. So Dryden is once again referring to the lack of metrical structure, to the lack of rhyme in Shadwell's poetry. Though they in number as in sense excel, just so like tautology they fell. Now once again they are repeating themselves. So Shadwell is endlessly repeating himself. That pale with envy, Singleton forswore. Here there is the reference. I'm sorry, I skipped a few lines. Saint Honoré's feet. Saint Honoré would have been a very famous French dancing master and the choreographer of Shadwell's play Psyche. And Shadwell referred to him as the famous master of France. Now, Saint Honoré's feet never kept more equal time, not even the feet of thy own Psyche's rhyme. So he says that your metrical structure is all awry, it is all spoilt, and that Saint Honoré even could not keep up his feet, the moving of his feet, with your own Psyche. So this is once again an allusion to Shadwell's own plays. Just so like tautology, though they number as in sense excel, so Shadwell has written voluminous plays, but all of them are tautological in the sense that they repeat the same plots and metrical structures endlessly. That pale with envy, Singleton forswore the lute and the sword which he in triumph bore. Now, Singleton here refers to John Singleton, one of the royal musicians who was often, employed in the theatre, and he played the part of Valerius, which is referred to in the next line, in Davenant's opera, The Siege of Rhodes. So, no major actor wants to play your poetry or your dramas in the royal opera. So they are so poor that all the major actors have declined to perform your plays. Here stop the good old sire. Who is the good old sire here? It is Flecknoe, father. Sire is father. And wept for joy in silent raptures of the hopeful boy. Now, you remember that any young man is referred to as a boy. Therefore, this good old sire wept for joy that he was passing on the mantle of folly, the dress of folly, the empire of folly to the perfect fool. All arguments that most his plays persuade that for anointed dullness he was made. So it is his plays which are the ultimate proof that he is completely stupid. And you see that metaphor once again, the metaphor of anointment, the metaphor of sprinkling holy water, and the metaphor of initiating a priest into the trade. So just as a priest is introduced into the mystical ways of religion, similarly, Shadwell is being introduced into the world of folly as the greatest fool by his father, the foolish poet Richard Flecknoe. So once again, remember, therefore, Shadwell is an embodiment of folly, stupidity, poor literature, and therefore lacking in rhyme. He creates only farces rather than comedies, and also a person of poor taste, an emblem of popular cheap culture without any sophistication. Now the poem will take a slightly different turn, and it will get back to a description of where Shadwell's kingdom lies. Now, you see, so far, Dryden has created a a history for Shadwell. He belongs to the ancestry of poor poetry, where his ancestors are Heywood, Shirley, Flecknoe, right? So his lineage, his genealogy is charted out, his history as a bad poet. Now Dryden will create a geography for him. What is the extent of Shadwell's kingdom? Right? He's already talked about the kingdom of folly, but what are the geographical dimensions of Shadwell's empire? That is what Dryden is going to hint at. And he says, close to the walls which fair Augusta bind. Now you remember that London has a very checkered history. At one point of time, it was conquered by the Romans, named Augusta. Therefore, Augusta is London. And there were the gates of London. You had London being sort of encircled by gates, Roman London. So Dryden is referring to these gates, these walls, which fair Augusta bind. The fair Augusta, and this is what is called a parenthesis, a slight aside in brackets, within brackets, right? The fair Augusta, much to fears inclined. The fair Augusta, much to fears is rumors. So already you had the rumors of the Popish plot, when Monmouth was seeking to sort of depose Charles, and London was a hotbed of rumors. So Dryden is referring to this rumor-mongering habit of the Londoners when he's talking about the fair Augusta, much to fears inclined. This is a reference to the Popish plot. An ancient fabric, so it's an ancient building, huge structure, raised to inform the sight. Now this was a watchtower once. Forts had watchtowers to see whether enemies were approaching. So this was called, the watchtower in London was called Barbican, right? Therefore, an ancient fabric raised to inform the sight, there stood of yore and Barbican it height. A watchtower once, but now so fate ordains, of all the pile, an empty name remains. So now it is in ruins. So this Shadwell's empire is situated within the ruins of ancient Roman London. It is on the outskirts, the suburbs of London, and it therefore resembles the ruins of the Barbican, resembles the ruins of Shadwell's literature. So every single metaphor draws upon an allusion, maybe classical, maybe Christian, but every single allusion is followed by bathos to suggest that Shadwell's literature, Shadwell's intellect, Shadwell's skill in writing plays is in ruins, is compared to either waste, urine and feces, chaos, or in this particular case, ruins. So successive metaphor, allusion after allusion, creates cumulatively this entire structure of ridicule and complete destruction of Shadwell, laughter after laughter. But in this particular case, in this particular paragraph, I would say, in this particular stanza, I'm sorry, what Dryden is doing is not only creating a satire against Shadwell, but he's also creating a satire against Grub Street and the rise of cheap print culture. Now, you'll have to understand the context, and therefore I will linger here for a moment. Now, what was happening in this period was that London was increasing phenomenally. Now, London, if you remember, Roman London or even Chaucer's London was a smaller area. Now, once colonial trade starts, and we are talking about, say, 80 years after the East India Company has already been established, and there's a phenomenal trade that is being carried out. You remember that cotton is coming in, spices is coming in, and suddenly, due to British expansionism, London is suddenly moving from one of the major cities of the world to probably the greatest city of the world, the most in terms of volume of trade. And therefore, there's a tremendous influx of people into London, and therefore London is bursting at its seams, right? In fact, there's a huge amount of people here, and therefore it is extending into the suburbs. Just as you can see, say, Bolpur or Kolkata extending into newer areas, similarly, London is extending. Therefore, what happens is the people who have low wages or who are professionally engaged in the lower professions are continuously being shifted to the outskirts of London. This happens in every city. Now, concurrent to this, we have the development of printing technology. Now, printing technology goes back to the 14th century, no doubt. But please remember that books and print were tremendously expensive. How expensive? A book normally in the 15th century would cost approximately the wages of an average person for almost 2 months. But now what is happening is that cheaper prints are being available. And therefore there's a huge glut, G-L-U-T, a huge explosion of various kinds of new literatures. What are these new literatures? These new literatures include, say, plays which are being published, high cultural, tracts, treatises, but also there are pamphlets, there's the newspaper, periodical essay, and also very interestingly, literacy is rising. So the common people are reading. And therefore, what are they reading? They're reading things for pleasure. And what are they reading for pleasure? They're reading stories about criminals, which are criminal biographies. They're reading war biographies. There's a lot of pornography. There's a lot of libel, scandal, yellow journalism, which is going on. And therefore, this place where cheap print is published is becoming a hub of popular culture. And this place is near Moorfields in London. And around this place is a long ditch or grubbe, which was a ditch in Old English, was called a grubbe, from which you have a name emerging. This is a concept. This was not a street, but this is a reference to a place called Grub Street. Therefore, this area where you have Moorfields, cheap print spaces is referred to in common parlance as Grub Street. Who are the people of Grub Street? You have printers who are printing. Around them, you have a sort of gathering of writers who are writing quick literature for money. And anybody who pays them, they will write. So these are called hack writers. Those of you who play cricket will remember that very often people are hired to play cricket. In Bengali, this is called Kep Khela, right? So these are hired writers, hack writers, who are writing very quickly for money. So hack writers stay there. It's a cheap place, remember, cheap lodgings. Also residing here are the prostitutes, because this is an area which is cheap, infested with a lot of people, and therefore there's a lot of clientele. Remember, some of these prostitutes are also acting in the plays. Theatre has opened its doors to women actors, but most early women actors are all prostitutes. In fact, the most noted female actor of the period was somebody called Nell Joine, who was the mistress of King Charles. So, prostitutes. You have the beer baiting houses and the gambling houses. Therefore, a lot of gamblers are coming in here. And also the male actors who are very poorly paid, they are also residing in Grub Street. So it's a mishmash of people. Prostitutes, literary hack writers who are like prostitutes, writing for money. You have punk actors. You have gambling dens. Therefore, this is an area which is an area of disrepute. Now, please remember that almost every city had this kind of a place. In Kolkata, for example, when print came to Kolkata and started to flourish, say in the mid of the 19th century, you had a place emerging near College Street, which was called Bottola. And you have the Bottola fictions, which were shot, you've seen those booklets, pornographic booklets, almanacs, Panji jetake bola hoy. If you have a Panji at home, go home and take a look at the pages. They are of very cheap quality, right? Panjis are very cheap. Almanacs are very cheap. But almanacs, you had popular cheap magazines of sensational stories. You had small popular booklets. Therefore, Kolkata too had its own Grub Street, and it was called Bottola, right? So what Dryden does is he shifts Shadwell to this Grub Street, this place of cheap culture. Now, please remember this, that Shadwell was a courtly poet. In fact, he was, as I pointed out, a poet laureate after Dryden. So Shadwell was not originally a writer of Grub Street. In fact, he was writing very sophisticated plays. But Dryden is creating a literary version of Shadwell, a satiric version of Shadwell, who is the emblem and the king, the emperor of Grub Street. So in this sense, from this point, you see, there's a personal rivalry between Dryden and Shadwell. But at this moment, the poetomachia, or the war of the poets, of the rival poets, is being broadened out into what we call a war of cultures, a war between high, sophisticated courtly culture versus cheap, popular culture. High culture, refined, moral, and is the emblem of taste. Popular culture, meant for pleasure, cheap, ephemeral. What is ephemeral? It fades away. It is very transitory, alpo shomoyer jonno. Whereas sophisticated culture is perennial. Now, you will remember that I had talked about when I was teaching detective literature about the ways in which popular culture is theorized through endless repetition. It is popular because it is cheaper, it is meant for pleasure, and it is consumed by the masses. Remember, the original Shadwell was not part of popular culture. What Dryden is doing is making a literary Shadwell the emblem of popular culture, and therefore broadening the scope of satire from poetomachia to a culture war. You see, how would high culture have felt due to the emergence of this new popular culture? After all, this was sort of eating away into their popularity, right? So this Dryden's response is the response of traditional high culture towards popular culture, one of disdain, dismissal, and satire. Therefore, you have to understand why this poem is relevant to us. None of you, for example, have asked me why I should read a dead white Dryden writing a satire against a dead white Shadwell. It has no relevance for us, frankly, apart from, historical importance. But its importance lies in the way in which one, satire operates, and two, in this conflict between cultures, right? Now, this conflict between cultures is not something that has died away. It is there. Now, very often today, high culture is also, or popular culture has taken on the garb of the established normative culture. So in the post-modern India, things have changed to a certain degree. But you need to understand that this conflict between high culture and popular culture is a culture war that has permeated down to our times. And it is here, you see, that the relevance of MacFlecknoe lies in the culture war that has continued into the 21st century. So, what is important to see is how Dryden is now going to define this area called Grub Street. By the way, the definitive book for you to read about the emergence of Grub Street is a book by Pat Rogers. It is called Grub Street Studies in a Subculture. Right? If you can, get hold of this book. We had a copy in the library. Now you can't access that. If you can download, all the better for it. But Grub Street Studies in a Subculture. You also have numerous websites dedicated to Grub Street. In fact, there was a journal at this point of time called the Grub Street Journal. You had Doris Lessing writing about Grub Street culture later on in the Victorian times. But the emergence of Grub Street is something which is very fundamental for our poem as well as for Pope's Dunciad, because Dunciad also becomes a trenchant critique against this subculture of Grub Street. So what Dryden is now going to set out to do is to establish the geography and the people of Grub Street. I think this is a very important segment of the text. So from its old ruins, brothel houses rise. So Dryden is referring to this suburban London as one where you have brothels. Now, brothels are important in this sense because Dryden is going to compare Shadwell to a literary prostitute, in the sense it's going to write this writing, hack writing for money. So scenes of, from its old ruins, brothel houses rise, scenes of lewd loves and polluted joys. So obviously Dryden is referring to the rampant sexuality and even sexually transmitted diseases during this period. You will remember that syphilis and gonorrhea were very rampant diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, which were prevalent during this particular age due to sexual promiscuity. Where there vast courts, the mothers' trumpets keep. So these were the people the women who controlled the brothels, the mother strumpets, as it were, and who presided over numerous younger prostitutes, and undisturbed by watch in silence, sleep. Near these, now, so therefore, Dryden has said that constituent one of Grub Street is the prostitutes. Constituent number two, near these, a nursery erects its head. Nursery is any place where somebody is trained. So where a child is trained is a nursery for children. Where adults are trained are nurseries of different professions. It is in this sense that nursery is being used. Near these, a nursery erects its head, where queens are formed and future heroes bred. So queens and future heroes, these are the actresses and the actors. So this is the place where the actors, the poorly paid actors, stay, where unfledged actors learn to laugh and cry, so they practice their craft, where infant punks their tender voices try, references to both young actors and actresses, as well as younger prostitutes who would call out to their clients. And little Maximins, the gods defy. Maximins, incidentally, belongs to Dryden's own play, who was reputed for his bombast. Therefore, Dryden is making fun of himself as well, his own tradecraft also, to his own poor plays as well. Great Fletcher, John Fletcher, was one of the great writers, the great dramatists of the Jacobean period, wrote tragicomedies. So great Fletcher never treads in buskins here. Buskins would be shoes with high heels, which the Roman theater actors wore so that they would, appear taller and superhuman almost. So great Fletcher never treads in buskins here, nor greater Johnson dares in socks appear. So even Ben Jonson does not appear in this particular place. So Dryden is suggesting that Shadwell's empire is a place which is unfamiliar to both Fletcher and Johnson. Now that Johnson is important here because, you see, Shadwell was claiming that Johnson was his literary ancestor. Dryden is creating Grub Street as a place where either Fletcher or Johnson would never try to enter. So Shadwell's literary territory and Shadwell's literary craft, Dryden says, is entirely unfamiliar to Johnson. Johnson is the sophisticated writer of humorous comedy. Shadwell is the writer of farce. It is thus that Dryden is trying to demolish Shadwell's claim of being a humorous comic writer in the tradition of Johnson. So he says neither Fletcher nor Johnson would appear in socks. By the way, just as tragic actors wore high-heeled shoes, comic actors would often wear socks only so that they would appear shorter, right? So, and it would look ridiculous on stage. So that's where Dryden is distinguishing Shadwell from either Fletcher or Johnson. So they are of a different class. Shadwell is of a different class. So instead, who lives there? If Johnson and Fletcher do not come into the picture, who are the writers or the actors who come here? Gentle Simkin, just reception finds. Simkin was a generic name for the clown. Characters who often entered into farces. Clown mane kintu Banglaye bhar, right? Low comedy. So if you've gone to a circus, you will see how clowns very often hit each other. Clowns very often perform absurd tricks and try to make you laugh by tickling you. Katukutu diya hashano arki. Forcible, farcical laughter rather than sophisticated, witty laughter, right? So, but Gentle Simkin, just reception finds. So in this place, instead of Johnson and Fletcher, you have Simkin the clown and amidst this monument of vanished minds, So monument of vanished minds. Look at that phrase. Isn't that the bathos? So Barbican is the monument, but a monument of what? Of vanished minds, absent intelligence. That is how the bathos generates the laughter. Pure clinches, the suburban muse affords. Now, the reference here is, of course, to puns. Pure clinches is puns, word plays, once again, cheap word plays. The suburban muse affords. You see, this you have to note, that Dryden resides in Drury Lane, which is the theatre lane of England, the high theatre lane. And Shadwell resides in Grub Street, which is part of the suburban muse. Dryden's muse is the urban muse. Shadwell's muse is the suburban, low-taste, cheap muse. So, therefore, I'm sorry, let me get back to the text. Pure clinches the suburban muse affords. So, the suburban muse is filled with puns, is filled with farces, has no taste. And Panton, waging harmless war with words. Once again, Panton is a clown, is a figure of a fool who exists in the different plays of the period. Here, MacFlecknoe, as a place to fame well known, ambitiously designed his Shadwell's throne. So here, the coronation of Shadwell is going to take place. Shadwell is going to be crowned as a monarch in this suburban place. For ancient Dekker, once again, this refers to Thomas Dekker, who was one of the more noted playwrights, comic playwrights of the Elizabethan era. Dekker's play, The Shoemaker's Holiday, was at one point of time in your syllabus. I don't think it is as yet, but Dekker was a writer of urban comedies. The genre that he wrote was city comedies, were all placed in London. So ancient Dekker prophesied long since that in this pile, so in this garbage, should reign a mighty prince. Now once again, he's creating Shadwell as an epic mighty prince, and then the bathos will come. Born for a scourge of wit and a flail of sense. So you see, this mighty prince, say for example, Tamburlaine in Marlowe's play, is this mighty prince who was a scourge of other princes, who defeat other princes. Scourge is a whip. But what is Shadwell a scourge of? Shadwell is a scourge of wit, intelligence. And flailing is once again threshing, beating of sense. So Shadwell is defined as a mighty prince, but of what? A scourge of wit and a flail of sense, a foolish man who wages immortal war with sense and intelligence. To whom true dullness should some psyches owe? Psyche refers to Shadwell's play, which was a considerable time in the making, but word of misers from his pen should flow. Now, The Miser, once again, is a play by Shadwell. Therefore, Dryden is now referring to Shadwell's plays as archetypes of poor literature, right? Therefore, Shadwell's texts are being continuously referred to. Humorists and hypocrites it should produce, whole Raymond families and tribes of Bruce. Once again, characters in the plays of Shadwell. So he's suggesting that Shadwell's verse his rhyme is poor, his characters are all farcical and clowns, and that his literatures are all foolish and of extremely poor taste. So it is in this way, you see, this Dryden is gradually leading up to Shadwell's final coronation. And therefore, Dryden has already created a history of Shadwell as a poor litterateur, as a poor dramatist. And he has also created a geography for Shadwell in the suburban areas of London. Now, you see, you have to notice that there are three levels of satire operating here. And the concluding part of today's discussion, I have more or less completed till page line number 94. So taking 50 lines a day almost. There are three levels of satire which you need to appreciate that Dryden is targeting. One is the robust personal satire against Shadwell, which is almost bordering on the lampoon character assassination, taking his plays and demolishing them one by one. There has been references to Shadwell's fat frame, lack of intelligence, his opium-taking habit, and so on and so forth. So this is a direct, personal, frontal attack against Shadwell, which is almost personal. This is point number one, satire number one, which is extremely vitriolic, juvenalian, and very personal. The second satire is against Shadwell as a writer of poor poetry and drama. So Dryden's attack is that of a greater writer against a poorer writer, against poor literature. This is the second attack. Here, the attack has slightly broadened out. And the attack is not only against Shadwell, it is equally against Heywood, Shirley. Later on, there will be another dramatist, Ogleby. There will be satire against, of course, Flecknoe. So Shadwell is not just an individual here. He is an representative of a long line of poor writers. So Dryden's satire is against poor literature. Literature without taste, literature without sophistication, literature without quality. This is the second level of satire. What is the third level of satire? The third level of satire is against a cheap print culture of Grub Street. This is a hostility of an established, higher, sophisticated culture against an emerging, popular, cheap print culture. And remember that this cheap print popular culture is threatening high culture and its market availability. So this is a more interesting conflict in that sense, which has a class structure as well. Dryden belongs to the higher elite aristocratic class. Shadwell, this literary Shadwell, of course, the original Shadwell did not belong to the cheaper culture. This Shadwell, the literary Shadwell, belongs to the lower classes with their farcical plays, with their libellous satires, with their prostitutes and punks and cheaper theaters. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to see MacFlecknoe not merely as a poem where one poet is attacking another poet, and that there are just political biases which are operating, that there is merely, Dryden is writing this as a propaganda literature against Shadwell and trying to demolish his poetry. It is a great work of satire, principally because it represents the anxieties of one literary cultural mode against an emerging other cultural mode. It is a hostility of cultures that we are more interested in. And we are also interested in the way in which, this difference of culture, or this opposition of cultures is playing out. Why Grub Street? Because Grub Street is also going to be the place from which the novels will evolve. And you see, there's a whole set of literature which is going to evolve from Grub Street, which is going to be the harbinger of many of the literary forms to follow. So it is from this point onwards, I'm suggesting, that a culture war is going to emerge. And Dryden's MacFlecknoe with Pope's Dunciad remains one of the first texts to articulate or to represent this war of the cultures. It is thus, therefore, that MacFlecknoe remains an important literary testament which documents the beginnings of a conflict. Apart from the fact, of course, that it is also a testament to the sophisticated handling of the genre of satire. Now, let me take you back to a text which I had discussed earlier, the original and the progress of satire, which Dryden wrote. Remember that Dryden had suggested that lampoon and caricature are the lowest forms of satire, and that Horace was the more moral of satirists, and Juvenal was of the greater delight because his satire was extremely dynamic, it was harsh, and it could bring out or attack the subject and generate ridicule and laughter much more robustly. Now put this in practice here. There are areas where Dryden's satire borders on the lampoon, attacking Shadwell personally. The scatology, in fact, creates caricature and ridicule. Equally, you see, when Dryden is attacking Shadwell or poor literature or poor culture, his strategies are to create bathos after bathos, irony after irony, laughter after laughter, ridicule after ridicule, not only against Shadwell, but also against poor culture, and therefore using a very dynamic, very robust, extremely sharp, incisive, Juvenalian mode of satire. When I made those points about Horatian and Juvenalian satire, we were largely speaking in abstract terms. I had created a theoretical, or Dryden had created a theoretical structure for satire. Now, I hope you can appreciate what Juvenalian satire and how it works. Right? When we'll study Pope, for example, we'll see how the Horatian mode of the satura operates. So once again, to fold up, 3 levels of satire: 1 against Shadwell, the poet, personal; 2, the satire against poor poetry, starting from ancestors like Heywood and Shirley, and also the satire against cheaper popular culture. The mode used is a mode of continuous allusion to classical, Christian, and literary sources. And it is through these allusions that Dryden is creating a heroic structure, elevating Shadwell to the status of a monarch and an emperor and a priest, and then through the bathos, denigrating him to the status of a literary dunce, thereby provoking laughter and ridicule, which is the true end of satire. In doing so, is critiquing both poor literature as well as poor culture, and of course also caricaturing and demolishing the literary reputation of Shadwell. It's thus that I'm arguing that Dryden's literary satire is operating. In our next discussion, we shall take up the episode of the coronation and see how one specific heroic episode will release the mock heroic laughters and create this entire structure whereby Shadwell will be crowned as an emperor of folly. But that is for another class. And with that, I would like to bring this recording to a close.